A very warm welcome to this Rayworth's Harrogate Literature Festival event. It's part of the Harrogate International Festivals. My name's Matt Stadlen. I'm a presenter, I'm a broadcaster, I'm a producer, I'm a writer. And I'm so pleased that you can join us for this, I think, very special occasion. We've got an amazing guest. It's Matt Haig. He doesn't look completely different from me.
Completely?
Not completely different. We're both, you kind of got red hair, right?
Yeah. Well, I didn't realise I used to have red hair. When I actually had hair on top, I used to convince myself I was sort of like chestnut brown. But when my beard comes in, I'm totally ginger bearded. But so yeah, we're kind of cousins, aren't we?
Almost.
Yeah.
When I interviewed you for my old LBC show, and I put a photo of you up on Instagram, and it was next to a photograph I put of myself, a sort of coming up photograph to promote the show and get people to watch. And I did definitely see some similarities. Anyway, it's a great privilege to be joined by a fellow ginger beard.
Yes, absolutely. And at least you've still got some action going on up here as well.
Yeah, I'm doing my best. We'll see. I don't know whether it will survive the next lockdown. I haven't said that if people want to contribute, they can, because these are free events, and it's really important, I think, to support the arts and support the festival, support the Harrogate Festival. And we are particularly grateful to Rayworth's LLP solicitors for continuing to sponsor the festival. It's just absolutely crucial. So thank you to you guys. Matt has written lots and lots of books, as you know. He's written non-fiction books, he's written novels, he's written children's books. Matt, I wonder how you sort of self-identify. Do you just see yourself as a storyteller, first and foremost?
Yeah, I mean, the weird thing for me was when I wrote Reasons to Stay Alive, because that became my biggest book at that point, and that was non-fiction, and that was totally new for me. But I mean, I've always sort of like thought of myself as like someone who writes novels, whether that's for kids or for adults, and makes up stuff and fiction. And then, you know, I was Mr. Struggling Writer for ages, wrote about 10 novels, if you include the kids' books in there as well, before Reasons to Stay Alive. And I'd always been dreaming of having the big book, the crossover, the sort of bestseller. And then that happened with Reasons to Stay Alive, which was, on the one hand, great, because it was a successful book and what I wanted, and it was helping people and felt like I was doing something useful. But on the other hand, it was kind of strange in career terms, because I suddenly became known as sort of like the mental health person. It's very non-fiction. I was having a lot of emails from people who are sort of seeking professional advice, and I'm obviously not a doctor or even a trained Samaritan or anything. So it was a kind of new world for me. But I still see myself first and foremost as a writer and as a fiction writer.
It does kind of come with some responsibilities, doesn't it? When you put yourself out there in the way that you have or I have. I mean, for 4 years doing those LBC shows, I'd often talk about very intimate stuff, including personal stuff to me. And you do get a lot of people then getting in touch and trying to tell you their stories and so forth. And I always try to respond. I hope I've always responded, but I make clear that if we're talking about mental health, and I made this clear on air as well, that I'm not a mental health expert.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was just a person who went through an experience, came out of that experience, wanted to make other people feel less lonely and slightly more hopeful within their experience. But yes, in terms of official advice and things like that, I mean, the scariest thing I ever got was actually just before COVID kicked off this year. I had a woman message me on Twitter who'd actually done something. She was in a life or death situation. She'd made an attempt on her own life, and I was literally the only person. She was living on her own. I was the only person she had told. She had some kind of anonymous Twitter handle, and I was in this sort of moral quagmire of what do I do? Do I actually go online and, you know, blast this woman's Twitter handle everywhere and ask for where she is? So I was in contact with the police simultaneously, and, you know, and I just thought, oh my goodness, this is enough. I mean, that story ended okay. She was fine. They found her that night, but that was just too much responsibility, I felt. I was like, I didn't sign up for this. This is too much. But on the one hand, it's lovely that people feel they can share their stories, and often that's all they're wanting to do. They're wanting to just have a place to share. So I get lots of those sort of messages. I just sort of thank you messages, but it's more the ones where you feel like an obligation to actually do something because someone's in a serious situation that I struggled with for a long time. And there was even a moment back in 2016 where I would have pressed the red button not to have written Reasons to Stay Alive. And yeah, I mean, that's helped for most people, that book, but it's also given me the most flack in other ways. You know, certain people say, oh, you're making money out of mental health and this, that, and the other. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, that's what you know, that's what mental health professionals do. That's what doctors do. That's, you know, it's not really, you know, I certainly didn't write that book to make money or for even any sort of sensible career reasons. I got paid a lot less money for it at the time. My publishers were trying to talk me out of it. It was just a book I wrote because, well, a friend asked me to write it, and I thought, after mulling it over, it seemed like a good thing to do. Where it was just the process of working out what sort of book it was going to be. Was it going to be a straightforward memoir or anything else? Anyway, that was a long ramble about Reasons to Stay Alive.
Well, it's interesting you talked about nearly pressing the red button, or you would have pressed the red button not to have written it just for a moment, because that links into the Midnight Library. You used a clever device as a means of seeing what our alternative lives might have been like, or perhaps still could be like. And it's a book full of hope. I say alternative. Alternative strictly, I think, comes from the Latin alter, and therefore means one or other. But actually, in the Midnight Library, there are so many different ways that life could have turned out or still could turn out.
Yes, this is true. And actually, there is some science to this. Not science to a Midnight Library, but there is science to this sort of infinite multiverse. There's a great book called The Hidden Reality by an American physics guy called Brian Greene, who's their kind of equivalent of Brian Cox. And I
interviewed him actually. I interviewed him a while ago. Yeah, he's an incredible mind, so lively, and he was just brilliantly able to answer all these questions, these layman questions that I was throwing at him about science and the universe and the meaning of life and philosophy. He just went bang, bang, bang. It was really good.
Oh, amazing!
The How To Academy, the podcast is up actually.
Oh, brilliant! Okay, I'll check that out. I didn't know that. Yeah, well, but in his book, The Hidden Reality, he does a very clever thing where he takes about 10 different branches of modern day scientific thinking, so a lot of quantum physics and mechanics and all of that, and different versions of science, which all leads to the same conclusion, which is there are more universes than this one. The mechanics of those universes obviously change. Some of those universes are literally almost like tracing paper over this one. And it's just like, if we make a different decision in this moment, then we're literally veering off into a different universe. Others are the more sort of, I suppose, old-fashioned idea of beyond this universe, we then encounter another universe. And all of them have their own supporters, but basically all the scientific community who study physics believe in some kind of potential for parallel universes. And that's been an idea that's fascinated me for ages. I love the idea of parallel lives, of how, you know, whether we could go back and correct things or regret, you know, it's like we're living, it's like our lives are a first draft. And as with any first draft, you're thinking, oh, what if I'd have just changed that or taken that paragraph out or put something else in? And so I've always thought it has a great sort of novelistic potential, but obviously it's been done a lot of times in various ways, in films and books. You know, you've got Kate Atkinson's Life After Life, which is kind of similar, and many other books, which I'm forgetting right now. You've got It's a Wonderful Life and Sliding Doors in terms of movies. So it's been done a lot. So I knew I needed something slightly different to add to the mix. And it was when I got the concept of the library itself, I thought, okay, yeah, this will work, because a library kind of is that anyway. A library kind of is access to other worlds and other lives. And it's a kind of statement on reading itself. I mean, in the book, it's not a metaphor, it's an actual thing, or that she perceives. But I personally like the idea of it being a reflection on what libraries actually are too.
There's a sort of meta element to it as well, of course, because you're an author, you deal in books, and you're using books as your mechanism for exploring the story.
Yes. Absolutely. And I suppose it was quite self-conscious in that sense. But I always feel like, because a lot of my books are in this sort of speculative fiction territory. And I wrote one called The Humans a few books ago, which was about an alien coming to Earth and possessing the body of this Cambridge professor of mathematics. And I had such a battle with my editors because they wanted it to just be it end up being an unreliable narrator, and he had had a breakdown. He wasn't really an alien, and aliens don't really exist. And I always fight for it, you know, like with the Midnight Library. And well, no, this is all happening. She perceives the Midnight Library, even though it might be her translation of the complexities of the quantum universe. She's actually in the Midnight Library. And so I always feel like you sort of owe it to the reader to give them the credit where they can read it as a fable if they want to, but they cannot necessarily think this is real or what really happens, but they actually buy into it in the story. It's almost like, I think I get it from children's books, where you kind of go with the daydream, you go with the flight of fantasy and actually commit to it and believe in it, rather than do the typical literary thing of sort of backing out and sort of, well, ghosts might not be real, these might be hallucinations. I like, you know, throw myself into it.
But there's a sense, isn't there, that people can feel that they're on the outside, that somehow everyone else is getting it right and we're getting it wrong. And you address that as an author, and it's a really important message, isn't it, that actually there's so much more commonality, so much more shared experience than perhaps we feel in our loneliest moments.
Yes, and I think it's a particularly contemporary feeling, this feeling of comparison, not just comparison with other people, but comparing how things could have been. We kind of, you know, it's the age of comparison shopping, obviously, and, you know, people who bought this also bought this. And it's the age of Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. And it's an age of overload of other possibilities and other lives. And it's paralyzing. One of my favorite little facts, which I think sneaks its way in somewhere into the novel, there's a character called Ash who mentions it. One of my favorite little facts is it relates to Dunbar's number. Do you know Dunbar's number? Which is 150. 150 being the average size of the average human settlement anywhere on Earth up until the 18th century. So all through the Doomsday Book, for instance, the average size of a village was around 150 people. When they go back to sort of Neolithic sites and archaeological digs, they often find like 150 or 140 or 160 skeletons all together. And so the evolutionary psychologists have taken this and said, actually, humans have evolved to meaningfully know within the course of their whole life about 150 people from birth to death. Now, of course, before we have our breakfast, we can encounter 150 people, you know, just by scrolling Instagram, 150 new people. And these wouldn't be the cross-section of people we'd have encountered in close proximity to us in our community. These will be the most sort of exceptional outliers on Earth. You know, these will be like the most conventionally beautiful, the richest, the most talented, this, that, and the other. And so we've got a million new ways to make ourselves feel inadequate or like we need to achieve more just to sort of stay level or to accept ourselves. Couple that with kind of like the sort of dreams we're fed on reality TV, where, I don't know, I'm not a snob about reality TV. I'm not a snob about your X Factors and Britain's Got Talents and all of that. But one gripe I've always had with them is in the sentimental aspect of backstory. The backstory always is ordinary life is something to be saved from. And like Simon Cowell is like the genie who can wave the wand and transport you to the shiny world of red carpets and paparazzi and glitter and movie premieres and record contracts. And you'll become One Direction, and then you'll be saved from your life in Barnsley or whatever it is. And I don't know. I mean, that's probably just a kind of minor thing, but it's something I've noticed that our obsession with fame and fortune, which has always been there, is all there throughout the 20th century, has been sort of mechanized, monetized in new ways in the 21st century. And when you couple that with the power of the internet and social media, and you've got a whole generation growing up now who present themselves more than they actually being themselves, who turn their own lives into magazines of themselves. And I'm not, again, saying this in a snobby way, because I use the internet far more above average. I'm like a Instagram addicted 15-year-old. I'm just like, I'm all over it. But I do also, I'm self-aware in terms of knowing the sort of mental health aspect of that. And I also believe that in 10 years' time, or maybe a bit longer, I don't know, depending how quickly we get up our game on this. And I think it's already starting to happen. We will really see it as a health issue, because I think two things are already happening. One is we're getting a better understanding of what mental health is, not just in terms of the personal aspect of mental health and the experience of mental health and the backslapping and congratulating each other for talking about mental health, but in the wider context of causes and social causes of mental health. Just has, over the last 50, 100 years, we've worked out a lot of the things that are bad for our physical health. I think we're a bit further down the path, but we're starting to understand that social media might be the equivalent of tobacco, but mentally it might be the equivalent of fast food, but mentally. And it's not about banning these things, but it's about actually understanding the health effects of these things. Yeah.
And there's, as well as the concerns about inducing feelings of anxiety and inadequacy, and problems possibly with addiction, distraction, taking you away from more nourishing interactions with the world and with those around you in your immediate environment. There's also, I think, potentially a problem with encouraging people to feel like they need or should desire followers.
Yeah.
And that's not just about inadequacy. It's not just, I don't have as many followers as I would like. And if you're into followers, you're never going to have enough, because you're always going to want to get more. In your case, you get to 400,000, you probably want to get to 500,000. In my case, I get to 18,000, I want to get to 19,000, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But there's something sort of potentially quite problematic with the idea that we are almost being encouraged to be mini Jesuses. The word follower,
yeah,
Jesus, don't you? Jesus had followers. And we are now being incentivized to put ourselves out there as people worthy of being followed. And there's something slightly weird about it.
There's something very weird about it. And also you get to a certain point where it becomes a trap anyway, because you then either, like, people have to either see you as a hero or a villain. And, being a neurotic person with low self-esteem, I can cope with people liking me for being a hero, but more often than not, certainly on Twitter, you get the villain or the pylon. And it's like, in both senses, it's not actually seeing you as a human being anymore. It's seeing you as this sort of abstract hero of what they want to think you are, or this abstract villain of who they want to imagine you are. And neither is a true picture. And both are actually quite stressful, because one's like this thing that you feel like you have to live up to. And the other's just like, oh God, am I really this bad? Am I really responsible for, I don't know, Donald Trump being elected or whatever it is today that you want to blame me for? And I find it all quite scary. But you're right, it does encourage followers. It encourages also to quantify our lives numerically, and anything that does that. And we've got increasing amounts of measurements where we value achievement. Obviously, we've always had things like earnings and stuff like that, but now we've got things like step counts, we've got BMI indexes, we've got Twitter followers, Instagram followers, how popular tweets are, how many friends we've got on Facebook. We've got, everything is becomes a number. And as soon as something becomes a number, obviously it's a metric that can be measured. So increasingly we're valuing human existence on things that are finite rather than things that are infinite. Instead of placing infinite value on a friendship, it now has a numerical value. And so it's therefore, however big the numbers are, it's automatically reduced, because it's becoming, you can have Kardashian levels of followers, but it's still a measurement. So you're still in the metric scale of quantifying things. Whereas, not to be too soppy about it, I think, that idea of infinite value, of human value, we're losing that a little bit, and we're placing humans next to each other on charts, when we're online at least. And you know, we don't do this with newborn babies. No one looks at a newborn baby and sees a lack of followers, or you know, wonders what the BMI is, or you know, wonder how much they're going to earn, or this, that, and the other. I mean, most people don't. I mean, there have been cases of babies who haven't even been born yet, who've got like 100,000 followers on Instagram because they're going to join a family of Instagram influencers. That has happened a few times. But in the general sense, we value a baby because it's a new human life full of potential. And yeah, I think we need to treat ourselves like babies in that sense a bit more, and actually value our intrinsic human worth rather than because of what we're doing, or because of what we're saying online, or because of our current political opinion that day, or whatever it is.
The risk is, as you say, I mean, friends, good friends, can suddenly become part of a lineup, and the risk is that it de-individualizes people, doesn't it? It depersonalizes things. You're emphasizing quantity over quality. I love the idea that you see friendship as an infinite thing, and something that shouldn't be categorized and lumped together. And I guess there's also an issue, I think, with, as you talk about tobacco and maybe alcohol and the possibilities of addiction. If you get a great response to a tweet, as I very occasionally have, and you get thousands of likes or thousands of retweets, it gives you this dopamine hit. I imagine, I mean, I don't know anything about dopamine, but I imagine it's something like that. It gives you some sort of high.
Yeah.
But it's the opposite, of course, of the pile-on, which can be a very negative experience if you don't get your filters right. And I've been attacked by sort of 2,000 trolls in a day or two once, and you know, I'm thick-skinned, but it sort of can almost spill into, or for some people it can spill into, what it must be like to be bullied in the playground. It's quite a nasty experience. But even with the high stuff, when you get that hit, and the likes keep going, and maybe if you're really lucky, it lasts 24 hours. After the likes stop, and it does sort of fall off quite quickly, you feel a sense of emptiness, and you suddenly realize that it was just 140 characters or 280 characters or whatever it was. It wasn't a great achievement on your part. It probably played to an echo chamber.
Yeah.
And anyway, now the loving has stopped, and you're left with your reality. And I think it, just like other addictions can, I imagine, it can sort of create loneliness. It might not be entirely different to someone who's addicted to sex. You keep going back for more, but you perhaps become more and more lonely.
Yeah, the thing you want to satisfy the craving actually feeds the craving. So it continually, with social media, it offers the promise of connection, and you get little tiny grains of it, but it never fills you up. It's like eating meringue, isn't it? And you never feel sated, but it's always sort of like tantalizing close. It's always offering you something, because you know in the abstract that you are actually interacting with human beings, but it never actually feels like that. It's never sort of four-dimensional reality. And yeah, I mean, I'm increasingly disillusioned with Twitter particularly. I mean, I know the others like Facebook and Instagram have their own health issues and mental health issues, and I think Instagram can be particularly toxic for young people who are bothered about their body image and all of that stuff. I can totally see that. But from my middle-aged male perspective, I find Instagram relatively like a safe space where people just try and be nice to each other. And it's often performative and fake, but I prefer that to the performative fake nastiness which you get on Twitter, where people have to be as angry as possible. And I often notice, actually, the thing I notice is when I actually carefully consider a tweet and write a nuanced tweet and try and be as wise as you can be within the short space of the tweet, it normally doesn't make much of a ripple. But if I'm not thinking, if I'm just using my sort of monkey brain and just sort of instinctively writing something really one-dimensional and angry or excited or something really not thought out, then those things will blow up as a sort of instinctive emotional reaction. So I don't think it encourages any kind of depth of thought, or I don't think it's good for debate in general.
It is interesting, though, that what you say there, that at least a genuineness, a sort of freshness, a realness can be picked up on. If you're overly contrived, that might not, as it were, work. But it's also curious that here I am talking to one of the country's best-loved novelists, and we're spending a great chunk of our valuable time together talking about social media, which is a sign definitely of the times, perhaps a sign of how you and I spend probably a little bit too much of my time. But I wanted to get back to your writing and ask you, well, as a segue into it, do you think your experience of social media, because you are on it a lot, has impacted in any way on your writing, positively or negatively?
Yeah, both probably. I feel like the negative is quite an obvious one. The negative is just that social media takes too much time and attention away from what you're doing, whatever you're doing. I mean, I try to be very disciplined with the Midnight Library. I had sort of 2 months last year where I wasn't taking my phone to bed. I was, leaving my phone charging. I wasn't having Sundays online at all. I was, doing various little things to try and get out of that mentality. And I get to a point with a book where I get so into the book, it overtakes being bothered about Twitter or worrying about who's being nasty to me or any of those sort of silly things. And, you get into the zone eventually, but it takes a bit longer in the social media age, I'd say, to get into that place. The positives, though, I don't even know if it's positives, but things that have definitely shaped it. I feel like books are more important now than ever, because they're this sort of like safe space away from that world of instant interaction and performance, where yes, you kind of in a very cerebral way interacting with the text you're reading, but you're not having to click a like button, you're not having to share it, you're not having to get back to a WhatsApp message, you're just having a deep level sort of social interaction with maybe someone who's been dead 100 years, and you're absorbing into it. So I feel like books are more important than ever. But I feel like my writing, more than some other writers, is sort of reflecting the times and maybe the attention deficit level. I'm quite consciously aware that we've got so much competition now. If you're reading a book, there's a million distractions. Someone's probably got their phone beside them that's buzzing. They've got 5 Netflix series they're feeling behind on, or whatever it is. And I feel like books have to sort of like acknowledge the times they're in. And it happens quite naturally with me. And since my very first novel, I've been, for instance, a fan of super short chapters. Like I'll mix it up, so there'll be a sort of a long chapter and then like a chapter that's like a sentence long. And I feel that's kind of like appeals to the way our brains are at the moment, where we want instantaneity and to absorb things quite quickly. But to try and provide depth within that is what I sort of try and challenge myself to do. In the Midnight Library, I think the fact that you're going through a story where she's literally living different lives. The Midnight Library itself is like some amazing post-life, pre-death social media where she can actually become all the different things, all the different lives she's seeing. So there's something equivalent. It's like a literary Instagram feed where you're seeing lots of different lives, I suppose. So that might be an influence as well. And also in a very literal sense, I've often tried things out. If I'm unsure about something, I'll try something out online. I was unsure about the title. And it sounds a small thing, but titles are so big, you have to get it so right. And I just didn't know whether it should be Midnight Library or The Midnight Library. And so I did a Twitter poll, and I think it was like 68-32 in favor of the definite article, in favor of it being The Midnight Library, rather than going the Midnight Cowboy route and just doing Midnight Library. So it can have its uses sometimes when you want to test things out. And I also think it's kind of leveled within book world. I think it's been quite democratic in some ways, because when I was first published in 2004, it was still to get your book noticed, there were still relatively few gatekeepers in charge of what made a book a sort of big hyped book. There was a few literary editors at the Times and the Guardian and Telegraph and stuff, and Radio 4. There was a few people you had to impress to become, you know, a sort of a Martin Amis or a Jeanette Winterson or whoever it was. Whereas I feel the internet age and the age of the blogger and the vlogger and Goodreads and Amazon, which I know is a kind of evil word, but in the sense of customer reviews is the one positive aspect of that. I feel like readers have a voice now. Readers are the media now. So I feel this whole concept of literary versus commercial, of genres being a little bit frowned upon, that has changed. Obviously, snobberies are still there, and sometimes snobberies are perfectly fine, and we all have personal tastes and all of that, but I feel like things are getting mixed up a little bit more. I genuinely don't know if I'm a literary or a commercial writer, and I genuinely ignore that distinction, because I used to be called a literary writer, but that was mainly because I was published by Jonathan Cape, the sort of literary imprint of Random House, and also because my books didn't sell. So you are therefore literary. Whereas if you start selling books, you become commercial. Or if you start having a bit of optimism in your work, it becomes sort of popular fiction. And it's very arbitrary what these distinctions are. And I feel like it's now easier in the internet age to kind of ignore all that book industry stuff, that marketing stuff. But especially if you do have some kind of social media presence where you can be your own marketing department. So I will shamelessly now plug a book on the internet. My view on it is, so long as I'm writing the book I genuinely want to write, that I would be writing for myself purely, I feel you also have to have a little bit of a business hat or a commercial hat. If you want to have a career rather than just a one-off book, if you want to have a career as a writer, you do have to think about the direction of that career, who your readers are occasionally. I don't mean when you're writing the book, but when you're promoting the book. So I'll be a shameless market trader when I'm, you know, promoting the book. I'll be shouting about my bananas. Yeah. But, you know, I feel like you keep the artist hat on and the creative hat on when you're writing the thing, and you do it your way. But the price of that, especially if you want to keep, you're not doing a series and you're wanting to keep free from idea to idea, you, as your safety net, you kind of need to also have the marketing head on all the other time when you're sort of doing your sort of, I don't know, Twitter giveaways or you're retweeting praise or whatever. I'm quite shameless about that. I don't know why that is. I just sort of grew up in a working class market. I don't get that literary thing where authors shouldn't be, you know, it's like, well, it's a job, it's a trade. You've got to kind of do that and yeah, be as creative and artistic as you want with your book or your sculpture. But then when you've got your gallery where your sculpture's in, you want people to come in and see it.
Well, it comes across as very natural and as though you're sort of almost can't believe your own success and your own luck. And I think it on Twitter, it comes across as though you're sort of sharing in the enjoyment with your fans, like you're all part of the same process. So I like that. I mean, there's so many jumping off points from what you've just said, so many different threads to follow. And I want to talk about how, because you mentioned how immersed you become in a novel, and I want to talk about that in that process in a moment. But it's interesting because you mentioned Amazon. I know you didn't mean literally, it's an evil word, but it's a sort of interesting relationship that authors can have with Amazon, because I'm sure it does us a huge amount of good in some ways. I mean, I'm thinking of my book, and I'm aware that there's probably carbon footprint issues or might be carbon footprint issues, and yet I will put the Amazon link up on Twitter. I mean, there is my book. I'm sure the majority of what I would have thought, the majority of people probably did buy it on Amazon. So it helps get books out there, doesn't it? It helps circulate books, but we have to remember that local bookshops are really, really important. And I certainly put out links to my local bookshop when I was promoting the book.
It's incredibly complicated because I used to be one of these authors who would publicly slag off Amazon sometimes. But then people were saying, well, you know, I can't afford to buy a hardback book any other way, or, you know, I have a Kindle for accessibility reasons and Amazon's main thing for that. So it's extremely complicated. And also, there are certain books that would have totally slipped under the radar of the old, very London-centric, very sort of old boys club literary world, that now, because of online selling, have an audience. I mean, there's super famous examples like, I don't know, The Martian. The Martian was a self-published book, which was a massive success as an ebook on Amazon, that every publisher ignored because it wasn't your typical genre book, and it wasn't sort of like a serious book. And then it was later picked up by whichever publisher it was and became bestseller. So there's lots of those examples as well, where famous books only exist really because of the sort of online selling.
Because they can get the momentum. I mean, you put something out there and people can just buy it immediately. Bang, bang, bang.
Yeah, no, exactly. And they know where to go. And if you're promoting yourself online, then selling it online. I mean, I think with this, the Midnight Library, it's for probably the first time in recent years I haven't done Amazon links, but that's only because I've been linking to Waterstones because they've got a special edition. But yeah, I think it's also, I don't think it's solely or primarily even the author's job to fix this. Yes, we have to acknowledge that Amazon are monopolizing things, and possibly not in a good ways, but it wasn't authors, for instance, who did things like the netbook agreement or leaving the netbook agreement, which happens in the UK famously around supermarkets and things like Tesco's back in the year 2000s, which basically is the reason why in Britain, unlike say in Germany, the price on the back of a book is almost never the price someone pays for that book. You go to Germany and you see however many euros on the back of a book, that's how many euros you're paying for that book. Whereas in Britain, ever since your 3 for 2 offers at Waterstones, your 1 for 2s in supermarkets, your Amazon famously price match the lowest discount that's going on it. People don't expect to pay that. So margins have got smaller and smaller. So writers have got less room to move in terms of their business model and how picky they can be. And, most writers want to be read. So if people are buying all their books on Amazon, you can't, and they're doing it for financial reasons or accessibility reasons, you can't say, oh no, I don't want you as a reader. So yeah, it's tricky.
I want to ask you then about being immersed in what you do, and just flesh out a little bit for us. And there's so many more questions I want to get to, but the experience of writing a book. You say that you kind of forget about social media for a while when you're really into it. What's it like being involved with those characters? What's it like being involved with Nora and the Midnight Library? What's it like when you really get down to the writing of it? How quickly do you write it? Do you still think about it when you're eating your breakfast? Do you go to bed thinking about the characters? Do you wake up thinking about them? How immersive is it? Tell us a little bit about the process.
Well, it's funny because I'm seen as a prolific writer because I technically have written quite a lot of books. But I think in one sense I'm a slow writer, in the sense that while I'm writing other books, I often have an idea that's bubbling at the back for ages. And this was probably 10 years in the sort of bubbling. And it took me years to sort of get the idea of the Midnight Library, but I'd always wanted to do a parallel life book. So there's this sort of slow burn phase where it's kind of there but not there, and you're not putting your main focus in it, and you're just occasionally thinking about it and daydreaming it. And then there's the get serious phase where you realize that this is a book you're going to write, and you sort of like initially force yourself to get immersive into it, and then it overtakes you and you naturally get immersive. The problem I had with the Midnight Library at first is I couldn't see the central character. I started writing, before there was Nora, I was writing as a man. I was writing about a man called Adam, and I wasn't seeing this character, this suicidal male character, because it was me, basically. I was writing myself, and it was too close to me. It was like when you look at your face in the mirror for too long and you have no idea what you look like, and you can never properly know what you look like without being outside of your body, which never happens. So I wasn't seeing the central character at all. So I had the neat concept of the library, and I was seeing all that. I was liking the idea of the book's opening, and I had the idea of the Book of Regrets, but the man I wasn't seeing at all. And very often the best changes you make to a book are the sort of big but simple changes. So changing that character to be a female character, which is always a risk when you're a male writer, just felt right. And I didn't want it to be right, because I thought, oh, I could get flack being a, male privileged writer writing this from inside the head of this woman, even though it's not a first person story. I'm very much in her head for a lot of the time. And I don't really want to do this. And I think that's when you know it's the right decision, when you still feel like you have to do something, even though there's a sort of nervousness about it. When you think, oh, that's the right decision. Like Reasons to Stay Alive always felt like that. I felt so nervous about it. I was so unsure about whether I should be writing it. And it was right. And I feel like you sometimes need that little feeling in your tummy that's a bit apprehensive. And I definitely had that about Nora. But from the moment I started writing Nora, I saw her as someone separate to me, and it made it easy to understand her. And also, it kind of gave me a green card to put actually more autobiographical stuff in there, because it was a shield of it being a character who was overtly not me. So, all that stuff, the sort of heavy stuff at the start where she's sort of moping wearily around Bedford and feels like everything's going wrong. That was me moping around Croydon when I had a sort of dead-end job in Croydon. I was on the cusp of having a full-blown breakdown under those sort of heavy South London skies. And I can really remember that feeling, and put a lot of that into her. And so in a strange way, probably more than my other sort of male characters, she's more autobiographical in some ways. I had to be aware I was writing a female character, but I didn't think that changed the sort of universal feelings of depression, suicidal feelings. It was more about how people would treat her, at various points in the book, the expectations people have for a daughter, especially if they're slightly old-fashioned parents, might be slightly different to expectations for a son. People would be treating her in a slightly more sexist fashion, but I didn't want to overdo it. I definitely just wanted to be true and not too sort of self-conscious of the fact that I was writing a woman. I just wanted to see her as a character called Nora.
Even though you're searching, and I suppose most authors are searching for some degree of universality, even though they're not saying this is everyone's experience, you're trying to tap into what it is to be human, I suppose. Did you nonetheless actively think yourself into a female mind? Did you? I mean, how much work did you do on that, and how challenging is that?
There was no process in that sense. I don't know. As soon as I saw her and I got a few little physical details of her, I never put too much physical description down. I don't like to see them too much, because I feel like that prohibits other readers from seeing them. I feel like when you've got too much description of clothes and hair and height, you see them within that paragraph, but then you kind of think, oh, what are they doing? Are they wearing a tweed jacket? Or I feel like having one little detail is enough for that. And with Nora, it was. It's not necessarily I saw her, but I just sort of felt her mind, and I understood her, and I understood her. She's not even a character who's looking for reasons to live. She's looking for the will to want to live. So she's that far removed. She's that in a state of depression, and I related to that feeling. And the challenge with Nora was that characters typically have to want something, and when you're depressed, you don't have that kind of will or agency. So taking a depressed character is always a challenge, but I suppose in a way she is kind of wanting answers, and she's wanting resolutions, and she's wanting to want something, even if she's not wanting something. So that's kind of wanting. And I don't know. I suppose with the central character, you kind of being them by proxy. So how much is that you changing, or they are just a version of you? I don't know, but it always has to feel kind of natural and never really like forced process.
Very interesting, Matt, that you say that you like to strip away some of the details because they can be distracting, or get in the way. And there are different ways, aren't there, of writing? There's that way, and where you see detail as a distraction, and then there's, say, classically maybe the Jane Austen way, where she seems to be so focused on the details that from those details, from her very acute observations, I don't think I'm just talking about clothes and so forth, but mannerisms and so forth.
Yes.
In that detail, you then reach more universal truth.
Yes. No, and I am for that. It's just, I suppose, my detail. I prefer like flashes of detail, like when you're actually offering detail, for it to be very, very specific and very sharp. But I feel like also if you've got, like, you can almost see someone through dialogue. I can sometimes think. I feel like, you know, when people always feel the need to add an adjective after sort of like, or an adverb after sort of he said or she said, and often I like a simple he said and she said, and not to put she said tentatively, but to actually put within the dialogue the feeling of that being tentative, so you can almost hear it rather than have it over described. But I break all kinds of rules, creative writing course rules in the Midnight Library. There's a lot of telling, not showing, for instance, which again, I suppose, is the internet influence. So that you've actually got literal status updates where she's sort of telling the world what she's feeling and stuff like that. And yeah, I think it's useful to know the rules, so to know how to break the rules and know that you're breaking rules and there's a reason to break them at certain points.
And on that question, just very briefly, of immersiveness, do you sort of go to bed thinking about the next day's writing? And how do you write that? Do you have a particular time in the day when you sit down at your desk?
Yeah, I definitely I'm a late night worrier about writing and work. So I'll always think, especially if it's been an unproductive day, I want to sort of like sort it all out in my head at night, or wake up with it. And I'm no longer doing the thing where I have a sort of notepad by my bed where I scribble, but I did go through years of that. I trust myself to, you know, notepads are great, but I think sometimes your mind is a natural filter. The sort of memorable stuff it will remember, and the stuff that you don't remember, you don't. Although, when you're writing the last half of a novel, I get a sense where you can see the whole novel, you can see the whole shape of it, you know where it's ending, you know the other characters you're going to bring in, but you're kind of worried it's all going to fall out of your ears and you're not going to sort of remember it. I mean, that's when you get the sort of urgency where it feels really 24/7, because you're wanting to get it all down before you sort of lose it all, because it's just in your head, and it's kind of a responsibility to get it out there, get the daydream out there.
To tell us a little bit about your sort of multiple selves, or if you see yourself as having multiple selves, because you spend a lot of your time doing this sort of thing when you're promoting, as do most authors, and that's a version of you and a way of communicating, and it's very natural. And then you have your writer self, where you're communicating on the page, and they're different selves, aren't they? Or they're different expressions of you. Do you sort of see yourself as a united whole, and that they're just different parts of the same thing, or do they feel very different experiences?
Well, in a weird way, 2020 has made it feel more unified. In normal times, it's often seems a very bipolar existence where you're either sort of shut away at home, you're writing, you're not seeing anybody, or you're out in a tent at a festival and you're sort of having to hobnob with other writers, and you're then sort of like the signing queues and all that stuff, which is exciting but kind of exhausting at the end of it after all the travel and stuff. And this year, because of our Zoom-centric existence, has felt like, you know, well, probably because we're always in the same physical place, it's felt a bit different. But also, I feel, you know, there's a tradition among writers, and I'm not judging any writers, but to almost be a bit dismissive about the promotion side, or dismissive of social media, or dismissive of ever sort of joining that real world in that way, and to kind of retreat into your ivory tower, do the work, let the work speak for itself. If you build it, they will come, that sort of attitude, which is the sort of traditional 20th century writer kind of attitude. But in another way, when you're writing a book, it's not necessarily the opposite of being on Twitter or being on Zoom. It is a kind of communication, and it's a kind of, publication has the word public in it, and you are just communicating. And so it's all different types of communication. And, that cliche about bookish people being very introverted or very shy and very antisocial almost, or wallflowers. I actually see books and reading as a kind of social thing, a kind of deep level socializing, where you're having a conversation. It might be a one-way conversation, but you're having a communication with the reader. Like when you're reading a book, you're kind of having a conversation with that writer. And so I see it all as communication, really. And I also feel very honored always to be asked to do stuff. I've still got that. I feel so pleased. I wasn't massive success for my first book, although I obviously wanted that at the time. I used to hear of these 6-figure advances and think, I want a bit of that. And I definitely used to resent being the sort of struggling writer who couldn't pay the rent. But I'm very glad now that I sort of went under the radar for at least about a decade, because it means that I'm sort of grateful for stuff that comes my way now. I know this is not the norm for most writers, and to be asked to do things all the time and stuff. So I appreciate it, and I try not to take any of it for granted. I have to say no to more stuff now, and I've got better at saying no. I had a few years where I was saying yes to things that I didn't really want to do. But yeah, I think staying grateful, and also staying with that feeling that you had when you were first a debut writer. I mean, the best thing about writing is writing. And if you don't believe that, then you're probably going to start writing stuff that's not so good or as passionate. I feel like that there's moments in a first draft where you get super excited about it and you can't wait to show them. And that is the same when you're unpublished and you're working on your first manuscript, to when, I don't know, when you're Philip Pullman working on the next book. I feel like if you've got that, that's the purest bit of writing and being a writer, and that stays the same. And the rest of it is nice, but it's slightly outside that.
It's so much fascinating stuff to ask from that. I think we haven't got a huge amount of time left, I know, but yeah, I guess given that you are so generous in engaging with your readership and with the outside world, and you enjoy that, because we talked about the negatives of social media, but presumably there's stuff you enjoy about it as well. But I can imagine that you also have to work a little bit hard to hold on to your integrity as a writer, to remember that you are a writer. And I just wonder how you see yourself at the moment, Matt, because you talked earlier about how you have low self-esteem. What has sort of success brought you? How has it changed you? Has it in any way altered your personality? Because you can these days be famous on Twitter and you don't have to leave your living room. And you're famous because you're a writer and you've written all this really important stuff, but you don't have to go anywhere. You don't have to go and walk on the red carpet. You don't have to stand on the stage, although you do at literary festivals. And you've got your kids and you sometimes put them on social media. You've got your wife, you've got your home, you've got your day-to-day life, you go and do your lockdown walks or whatever. In a way, I can imagine that fame might not have changed you at all, or not changed your daily reality. You're not going off and driving fast cars with a supermodel, or maybe you are, but not as far as I know.
I can't drive. That hasn't changed. And no fast cars. We've got our nice little Mini, and no supermodels beyond my wife, obviously. But no.
Has it changed you in any way? Has it? What impact has it had on you? Have you felt your personality in any way shift? You kind of get what I'm saying.
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to have people who bring you back down to earth. I mean, I think simply because I've never really lived in London, I've never not since I've been sort of well known in any way. I don't really get, even pre-COVID, I didn't get invited to things that often, and I'd often sort of like turn them down for practical reasons anyway, so I'd stop being asked. And I think there's points, there's moments where you can get a little bit risk of inflated or believing your own hype about certainly writing. That's kind of a dangerous thing. That stops you. You need to be self-critical as a writer. It may not be a great trait to have in terms of being a happy human being, but you kind of do need as a writer to be able, it's a balance, because you kind of need a bit of swagger and confidence and arrogance to think, oh, the world wants to read my daydream. That's kind of an arrogant thing. But you also need to be self-critical enough to say, to have your own, you know, Hemingway's idea of a bullshit detector, and to actually know when you're writing crap. And falling in love with your own style. And you know, there's certain writers I've admired where the later works you feel, oh, they're sort of doing a karaoke version of themselves, and to stay fresh, I think you need that sense of self-criticism, or at least self-awareness. But yeah, I mean, being a writer, there's a risk of occasionally feeling self-important. But I'm very lucky in that I've got 3 human beings I live with who do not put up with that for more than 5 seconds. So, and also I had years of agoraphobia. So I even though I'm not agoraphobic now, I'm very used to being inside and with my own people and doing that. So this year for me probably hasn't been as challenging. Well, because I'm privileged in terms of my job hasn't been affected, but in the sort of psychological sense hasn't been as challenging as it has for some, I'd imagine, because I'm quite used to being in a kind of, well, I was in a lockdown all my 20s, but that was a psychological enforced one. So yes, that was a very rambling all over the place answer. But basically, I don't know. I feel like a lot of neurotic people, I swing between arrogance and deep insecurity. But you know, when the pendulum's somewhere in the middle, I'm just about a normal human being.
When I started out interviewing, I did a series called 5 Minutes with a giant alarm clock on the BBC. I did about 220 of those. And I had to interview famous people in exactly 5 minutes, no editing and no notes. And I just, wow. You know, I think Jackie Collins answered the most questions in 5 minutes. I think she answered about 39. And Jonathan Miller answered about 6. And neither of them, sadly, are still with us. But I wanted to try and get a sense of who they were. And now my interviewing, I guess, has become more about the trade.
Yeah.
There is still a desire, isn't there, amongst fans of well-known people to get to know the person a little bit. And you're very free and generous with your emotions and your feelings about things on Twitter, but I don't know how much we know about you. And I'm interested to know just a tiny bit about you, about what makes you tick and what excites you, but also your view on whether we should be interested in that and whether we're remotely entitled to know anything about you.
It's very strange because when I was just a novelist, no one really cared. But then I wrote Reasons to Stay Alive. And I think because I put so much sort of personal stuff in there, it's very strange when people come to you and want to give you a hug and like tell you about their life. It's both simultaneously nice and flattering and also slightly unnerving when people know you, but you don't know them. And I find there's something sort of therapeutic about social media where I'm just talking about my mental health and stuff, because I had so long of not doing that. So I never think I'll get over that. I'll never think I'll get over the fact that I actually find it therapeutic to talk about my own mental health, because I lost friends because I didn't tell them about my depression, and so I just have to cancel things and not say anything and not give them reasons just because I couldn't talk about it. And that went on for like 10 years, and I've got a lot of those friends back now from being honest and stuff. But it's so strange that I'm this public mental health person, because I am actually a private person in lots of ways, and I was very private about my mental health for years. And, you know, in unhealthy ways. And then I'd go off and go crazy and, you know, drink far too much and sort of phone Andrea from 4 a.m. at Victoria Station after having been to a casino and things like that. I did crazy stuff when I was in that limbo myself before being honest about my own mental health to people. When I was thinking I was in recovery, but I wasn't properly. So since then, I actually feel the need to have, that's why one of the most infuriating comments I get on Twitter, and the ones that I really take personal, are the ones where they say, "Oh, I'm just talking about mental health for my career," or this, that, and other, or selling snake oil. I've only written 2 non-fiction books about mental health out of like 18 books. I've written more books about Father Christmas than I've written about mental health. That's one thing. I've made more money. The book I made most money for was a book about Father Christmas, because the film happens, and that's coming out next year. So this idea that I'm just there, it's like if I had no book career, I would be talking about my mental health online, because I like it, and I like the people sort of responding to it and echoing that experience. And I had years of not having that, and obviously I had a breakdown pre-social media, and just being a young man, I found it incredibly hard to talk about for years. And so once that genie came out of the bottle, it wouldn't have gone back. And I like talking about mental health, and I like feeling of some practical use to people, because you don't often feel that as a writer, because being a writer is quite self-indulgent, certainly a novelist. So the fact that I can do something that feels vaguely helpful to people is a good feeling, and it makes me feel like a better person. But yeah, no, I don't know. I mean, aren't we all kind of mysteries to ourselves? I don't really know what motivates me. I think there's that combination definitely of sort of low self-esteem, but with a kind of arrogance as well, where because of your sort of low self-esteem, or because of not being taken seriously when you were younger, or whatever it was, you kind of need to continually prove yourself to the world. So I'll kind of never run out of ambition creatively or wanting to be out there in the world, because I think there's a bit of, oh, look at me, because I felt a bit ignored when I was younger or whatever. But beyond that, yeah, I don't really have a psychological total understanding of myself or my...
And how is your mental health?
My mental health is reasonably good. I never say I'm in one state of 100% wellness like I used to do, because I think that's kind of dangerous to say, because then when you start feeling bad, you end up feeling really bad, because it's like a sort of drop of ink in water, and then everything clouds. Because if you start believing the myth that you're 100% mentally well, you can't cope with, like, if you have a panic attack out of the blue or whatever it is. I felt like this year it's been a bit of a roller coaster. I mean, because in one sense, as I say, I can cope with being indoors, and I can cope with lockdown, I think, better than most people. But I'm a natural hypochondriac. So my health anxiety has been through the roof, not just about me, but about my family, about my parents. Yeah, I haven't been necessarily that easy to live with at times this year, and certainly not when I'm phoning my parents and telling them off about things. So that side of it I found kind of hard. But I've realised that things aren't binary, things aren't one thing or the other. I definitely feel like I'm in a happy patch in my life generally, but I'm also in a kind of anxious patch as well. So it's kind of like a lot, I'm feeling a lot of things.
Final question, Matt. I've very rarely done this. I think I've only probably done it once. I did it with Rory Bremner, also for the Haig Festival. And I just suddenly realised with him, and I've realised with you, that I sort of parachuted. I mean, lots of people know your biography, but I sort of parachuted you in as an interviewer to this conversation without sort of explaining, as it were, where you came from. So can you give us, in 1 minute, maybe 1.5 minutes, a potted biography of Matt Haig, as to how you got to where you got to?
Okay. I was born in Sheffield, raised in Newark-on-Trent in the Midlands. Middle-class kid, working-class town, felt like an outsider. Met my wife when I was 19, didn't get married for 13 years after that in Las Vegas. Had a breakdown when I was 24. And it was for having the breakdown when I was 24. I'd been a sort of hedonist, wanting to escape myself. So I'd ended up in Ibiza, took loads of drugs, drank lots of alcohol. And I wasn't on drugs when I had a breakdown, but it obviously played a part in being sort of unhealthy. having that breakdown and recovering from that breakdown actually gave me the confidence to become a writer. And the reason it gave me confidence is because I went through 3 years of thinking it was impossible to recover. I went through a year of thinking it was impossible even to stay alive. I was convinced I'd be dead at the age of 25. Then I wasn't. Then I thought, well, I've already done an impossible thing. Like, it literally was an impossible thing for me, what I felt like was an impossible thing. So after that, like getting a book deal, having my name in a book, whatever, felt like an easy thing. And I had this sort of, I was like a tank, and I didn't care about rejections. It was all part of the process. I had like 40 rejections, eventually got an agent, eventually got a book deal, wrote a few books with Jonathan Cape, got dropped, then took things into my own hands, just to start the social media age, went to Canongate, kept on, I sold myself to them, got in through the door, was determined not to let go, and I'm still being published. And I feel at this moment in time, I have quite a lot of creative freedom to write what I want to do. And I feel like success is creative freedom, where you can do things you want to do. That's the main definition of success. And I feel very privileged at this point in time, although I live a completely imperfect, normal human existence.
I feel very privileged to have spent the last hour with you, Matt. It's been absolutely wonderful. It's really interesting to get insights into how you write, into how you operate, how you think, what you think. It's just been a real treat. So I'm really, really pleased you did it, because you do lots of this sort of stuff. And I know everyone at Harrogate will be grateful. I know the audience will be grateful. The people who run it will be grateful, because I do think that literary festivals are part of the lifeblood of this country's culture. Yeah.
I love Harrogate. Can I just say, I know not everyone watching this will be from Harrogate, but I do like Harrogate. I lived in York for ages, and Harrogate, love Harrogate. We used to have fancy days out and go to Betty's in Harrogate, and they've got great, hopefully it's going to be open and running normally, Everyman Cinema in Harrogate too, where I spent my birthday last year in Harrogate. So yes, big love to Harrogate.
Big love to Harrogate. Big love to you, Matt. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to everyone for joining us as well. And of course, the Midnight Library is available on Amazon and all sorts of other outlets.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Matthew. Thanks, Matt.